A decade of fighting, hundreds of thousands of lives lost and millions of people displaced. It's 10 years now since civil war broke out in Sudan's Darfur region, but the area remains racked with conflict, with local tribes now turning on each other, and efforts to forge lasting peace have so far failed. This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Jane Dutton. Welcome to the programme. The people of Darfur are among the poorest in Africa, and for 10 years now, many have been living in desperation in refugee camps, in fear. In 2003, predominantly non-Arab rebel groups in Darfur took up arms against Sudan's government, accusing Khartoum of neglecting them. The government backed local militias to put down the insurgency in what became known as the Scorched Earth campaign. Some Arab tribes have since turned on each other in battles for control and resources, changing the nature of the conflict. But it's civilians who are still suffering the consequences, and aid groups say they are struggling to cope. For Inside Story, Ishag Mekki has this report.
Darfur may have faded from the world's attention, but for many the conflict has never left. War and famine have plagued this region since February 2003. When African tribes rebelled against a central government in Khartoum they believed was marginalizing them. Dwindling resources left both sides arming themselves to defend their interests, and fighting erupted. The Janjaweed militias of mounted gunmen have been blamed for atrocities including murder, rape, looting and burning rebel villages. The government has been accused of arming the Janjaweed, though Khartoum has consistently denied this. The result has been one of the world's worst humanitarian catastrophes. According to the UN, an estimated 300,000 people died in its first 5 years of conflict. But again, Khartoum disputes the number, saying 10,000 died. More than 1 million are still displaced in camps. In 2007, a United Nations African Union peacekeeping force known as UNAMID arrived in the region. But fighting continued in many areas, with government planes bombing rebel positions in West Darfur. Almost a year later, the International Criminal Court's top prosecutor called for the arrest of President Bashir for genocide in Darfur. The government rejected the charges. A new peace agreement was reached in Doha in July 2011 between the government and the Liberation and Justice Movement, an umbrella group of rebel factions. But the main rebel groups, GEM and factions of the SLA, did not sign. They felt a number of issues were not addressed: power and wealth sharing, punishment for human rights violations, and compensation for those displaced by the fighting. Although much of the violence has ended in recent years, the goal of comprehensive peace and prosperity in Darfur remains as elusive as ever. Ishag Mekki, Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests. In Khartoum, Safwat Fanos. He's an associate professor of political science at the University of Khartoum. Joining us from Dubai, Ishag Mekki, Secretary General of the Darfur Victims Organisation of Relief and Rehabilitation. And in our London studios, David Hoile. He's a professor of media studies at Sudan International University and author of the book Darfur, The Road to Peace. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Safwat, 10 years on, Sudan, very different place, split in two after the South got its independence. But in Darfur, it certainly seems on the ground and for people living there that very little has changed.
Well, the Darfur problem has a very long history. It started and really escalated in the 1980s when the drought hit the Sahel region, and then there was a struggle over resources. Basically struggle between the pastoralists and the farmers, between nomadic tribe and farming tribe. And they were fighting over scarce resources, fighting over land, grazing land, farm land, etc. And most of these conflicts at that time were settled by traditional methods. People killed, they were compensated, agreements were made between tribal elites, and life went on. But then in the new millennium started starting around the year 2003, the conflict in Darfur started to have a very strong political dimension, which was linked to the overall political crisis in the country. The Sudan People Liberation Army, led by John Garang at that time, was spreading the revolution or the rebellion northwards. It was expanding in South Kordofan, in Blue Nile, and also in Darfur. And therefore, it gave support to some Darfurian elements, especially from African background, to form the Sudan Liberation Front,
now,
which adopted a secular ideology,
they claim, because
and
they had
was
been
talking
overlooked
or fighting
by the government in Khartoum. They didn't feel that they were getting anything from the government.
Yes, very little has changed, because the political crisis in the whole country continues, and therefore the Darfur crisis is part of the overall political crisis. It is not separable from the overall political crisis. And therefore, these rebel armed groups in Darfur, they have links to either factions in the north, or they had links in the past and continue to have link with the SPLM, which now control the new country in South Sudan.
Ishag, your family, I'm sorry to hear, was caught up in some of the atrocities in Darfur. Can you give us a sense what happened and if you are seeing any changes on the ground?
Yes, sure. I think what Dr. Fanos is saying is quite a long time ago, that issues and problems in Darfur sorted tribally and locally. But then in 2001, 2, 3 onwards, the government have jumped in and backed Arab background against African indigenous tribe in the area, and then they launched a war to eliminate those Darfurians because they only asked to have a share in a power and resource in the country, but denying them by waging war, and that have lost nearly 300,000 Darfurians, including members of my family. And this is grievances we have been suffering since 2004, and now it is the 10th anniversary of this war since it started. And there has been many negotiations in international venues, more than 6, 7 in 7, 8 countries, but all of these negotiations have never finished or come to a political solution for the crisis in Darfur. But the crisis have moved and shifted to South Kordofan and to Blue Nile in the same style orchestrated in Darfur. The government has used anti-Nov army and wiped up all of these tribes. And those also end up in camps in Ida and in South Sudan. And this is, I think, the way of the government of Sudan running this war. It's leading to conflict over all the countries. I think it's very unwise to distribute weapons to tribes to fight against other tribes, which is a very unplanned business. And now,
okay, let me bring David in. I mean, you've written a lot about Darfur over the last 10 years. Do you think that's a fair synopsis of what's happening, and how much change have you seen in the last decade?
Well, I think what you've just heard, in fact, is a sort of rewriting of history, which obviously serves one or more sides. The simple fact is that the war in Darfur is not about marginalization, and that's a very useful thing to claim. But Ghazi Suleiman, who is actually Sudan's leading opposition human rights lawyer, no friend of the government, has made that point very, very clear. The actual conflict in Darfur is not about marginalization. Our first speaker, I think, actually raised the point that it's in effect a national, a national war, which happens to, in this instance, have been fought out in Darfur. Back in the early 2000s, there was a big falling out between the government of Sudan and the Islamist faction led by Dr. Hassan al-Turabi. Most of Dr. Turabi's support, or a large amount of it, actually came from hardline Islamists in Darfur. These people then formed the backbone, in effect, of one or two of the rebel movements. So it's been fought in Darfur. It's been a tragedy.
So do you think Darfur, what has happened in Darfur, could become a blueprint for other parts of the country?
Well, I think in many instances, groups outside of Sudan have actually tried to make that the case. There's no secret that you have a number of governments, including even the US government, who have actually pursued a policy of actually dividing up Sudan, so basically dismembering it. So it was actually helpful for the Americans and one or two of their allies as well. And it's also been helpful in terms of one or two other groups who've also sought that dismemberment. So as a blueprint, no, I think at the end of the day, the entire country is marginalized, north, south, east and west. There are groups and communities in the far north of Sudan that are far more marginalized than in the west or even in the former south. So
okay, let me put that to
the issue. It's
Safwat.
about politics.
Okay, let me put that to Safwat, if I may. David was saying there that one of the reasons that this has been allowed to happen, the ongoing fighting in Darfur and the displacement of people, is because of US dismemberment in the country. Do you agree with that?
I think, as I said, that the problem of Darfur is part and parcel of the overall political crisis in the country. The intense struggle to capture the state, to control the Sudanese state by different parties, by different groups, regionally based or even at the level of the center. And this intense political crisis have led to the separation of South Sudan. And it continues to destabilize Darfur, the South Kordofan, and the Blue Nile state. And it threatened to spread even to East Sudan and who knows, maybe other parts. So it has to be seen as a lack of national consensus on how to rule the country, how to compete over state power. Should it be in a democratic way, in a peaceful way, or should it be using violent means?
How key is discussions with the rebel forces? They haven't been successful until now. Any chance of getting that back on the table?
Well, the experience have shown that all the past efforts over the last years have ended with partial peace agreements, not a comprehensive peace agreements with all the armed groups in Darfur. And these partial peace agreements didn't work because the groups that didn't come to the peace agreement continue to carry weapons and therefore continue to destabilize the region, make the dismantling of the camps very difficult, because these people, unless they feel secure, they will not go back to their original village and to their normal life. So therefore, what is needed is a comprehensive peace agreement, not only in Darfur, but I think in the whole country, because we cannot separate the political crisis in one part of the country from the overall political situation in the country.
Do you agree with that, David?
I think at the end of the day, for example, in 2003, 2004, you had maybe 2 or 3 rebel movements. You've now got, I think, in excess of 25 or 30 separate, distinct factions, splinters, or organizations. So it's a bit like herding cats in that sense. I think also the sad thing is you have a huge number of vested interests in the war being prolonged, the war continuing, and this is the crisis which I think is most acute. You've seen that result in rebel groups actually being told not to reach a peace agreement, to actually withhold themselves actually outside of negotiations, and to let the war continue.
To what end?
So this is one of the... Sorry?
To what end?
To what end? To actually carry on the war in Darfur, to carry on destabilizing the government in Khartoum, to actually go down the road of keeping Sudan off balance.
And who would be benefiting from this regionally? I mean, Chad has been implicated in the past. Eritrea has been accused of supporting GEM fighters.
Well, that's right. I think you had a number of actors. One, first and foremost, is the American government. You have sections within the American government who historically have always actually sought to dismember Sudan and keep it off balance for whatever reason, political, economic, and so on. You also then have regional players. I mean, Chad from time to time. Libya under Gaddafi was a person who certainly played actually both sides of the border and actively encouraged the rebels in Darfur actually for his own particular sort of regional motivations. You now, of course, have the government in South Sudan, who again are actually pursuing a policy of encouraging the rebels in Darfur to continue in the field. So this is the big difficulty about reaching any peace agreement.
Okay. Now, while Darfur's rebel groups say they're keen to push the peace process forward, it's infighting between Arab tribes that's now destabilizing the country. Fighting over control of a gold mine in North Darfur is reported to have killed more than 500 people. Dozens of villages are said to have been destroyed. The UN says 7 weeks of fighting has seen 100,000 people displaced or severely affected. That's adding to some 1.4 million displaced people already living in camps. Ishag, what are you hearing about the fighting and the displacement of so many people?
Yes, before I answer that, I'll take what Dr. Fanos says is about the peace, comprehensive peace agreement, and that the crisis of Sudan politically are all connected to all regions of Sudan, and it's very important that Sudan government not to pursue a partial peace agreement because it will never lead to political settlement. Yes, indeed, in North Darfur there is the Arab tribes among themselves now fighting fiercely, and over the last 3, 4, 5 weeks, it's not 500 that been killed. I think it's over 1,000 people has been killed, and many people have been displaced. And this is because, as I said earlier, that unplanned business by the government, that they distribute weapons to Arabs to eliminate the African background from the area.
Yes, there certainly have been allegations that government-issued weapons were used in these attacks and that some of the fighters are on government salaries. Why would the government be getting involved in this? Or there's another school of thought, these rebel fighters have these weapons from the government because they were sponsored by them in the past, from the days of Janjaweed.
Well, what I am saying here is the Janjaweed, when they first formed to fight within the Darfur region, that's the time when government has distributed weapons, and now they're unable to collect and disarm these arms from the Janjaweeds themselves. Therefore, now it is beyond their control to bring peace and stability in where the fighting about the gold mines in North Darfur. And if this is from the very beginning, they look into this matter deeply, they will never ever distribute these weapons to the Arab to fight African background. For that, this is what I'm trying to say. But the rebel group have never have any issues or connection to the gold mine in North Darfur or the fighting now currently taking place in North Darfur.
Fanos, how is the government viewing this fighting that's happening in North Darfur? I mean, they must be pretty concerned about this, these tribes turning on each other. It's a different angle to this battle there.
The government views it as a conflict among the local people in the area over resources, this time mineral resources. And therefore, the government is not a party to this conflict in any way. It is not siding with one party against the other. The government is trying to mediate, to try to solve the problem over competition over this gold mines and over the land where the gold is supposed to be found. And therefore, it is trying through negotiation, through mediation, through local elites to reach an agreement whereby these local people agree among themselves on how to distribute this valuable resource, i.e. the mineral, the gold, in a way that it doesn't end up killing each other or fighting each other. And here we go back to the original cause of the whole problems of Darfur, the conflict over resources, scarce resources.
And
whether
what
the
role
scarce resources is
does Bashir have in this? He, along with 3 others, have been implicated by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity in Darfur. Does he still have some role there?
No, the case of the International Criminal Court, the consensus in Sudan, at least in the center here, is that it is a political issue. It has been politicized because Sudan is not a party to the ICC. The political issue is that it has been turned by the Security Council under pressure from the United States to the ICC. Okay? And therefore, the issue has become part of the political struggle between the government of Sudan on the one hand and the Western powers on the other hand.
David, do you think Darfur would be in a
the
better
position
situation
of Sudan has been backed by the African Union and the Arab League?
David, do you think Darfur would be in a different situation if the ICC had been more effective, if Bashir and those other accused had been handed over?
No, actually quite the contrary. In fact, if I could actually preface my answer to that by coming back to what our friend from Darfur actually said. I think we have to actually cut away so much of the propaganda that naturally sort of accretes to any civil war. And this concept that it's a racial war is absolutely nonsense. It's a climate war, it's a war about politics, it's many things, but it's not a racial war. So to keep on trying to actually project this as a war against Africans by Arabs, they're all black African in a sense in Darfur, whether they're Arabic speaking or otherwise. The ICC is the key example of how international mismanagement of Darfur has artificially prolonged the conflict. The second the ICC became involved, illegally as it is, because Sudan's not a member of the Rome Statute. The second the ICC became involved in Sudan, the onus was on rebels not to engage in peace talks. They were told, we'll just wait until next year, 2 years later, and President Bashir and the entire government will be in The Hague. So this was one of the things that has artificially prolonged the conflict in Darfur. If there's anybody who has blood on their hands, it's the officials actually within the ICC who actually made the indictments against President Bashir and members of his government.
Yes, let me say this. I think this discussion that I start to feel like David Hoile, he's looking like he's Sudanese more than Dr. Fanos and myself, really, and he's more concerned about more than both of us in this take. But let me say this about the International Criminal Court. I think people have been killed and died by the international, witnessed by international, and if this scale of people have been killed, somebody must be responsible and somebody must be brought to justice. And without getting justice to people of Darfur and Sudan, and any political solution without this, it's going to be fragile and it's going to be difficult to implement.
We've been getting a lot of comments on our Facebook page. Let's look at some of the responses. Alilibu Sukuya says, I served as a Nigerian soldier, UN peacekeeper in Darfur in 2008 and 12. I saw hell on earth. Please, the world needs to do more to help the vulnerable there. Thank you, Al Jazeera. Mohammed Issa says, war breaks out as a result of injustice. There can never be peace in the continent or part of the world except when there is justice. Justice is what we should keep fighting for. And Abdel Kader Omar Tal says, lasting peace can only be achieved if the US and China drop their interest in Darfur's oil fields. And those Facebook comments take us to the end of the show. Safwat Fanos, thank you very much. And you too, Ishag Mekki and David Hoile. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Don't forget you can find this program and many more on our website. That's aljazeera.com. Follow the links. Thanks again for watching. Bye-bye.